The bigger question is sort of this abstract notion of risk avoidance. And I think you have to have that eye to risk. Sometimes we're doing stuff that we hopefully will never need. But if a climate event does happen or something more serious at a macro, scale, a global crisis happens, that we can contribute to avoiding, that has a significant risk mitigation impact that's a little bit harder to capture and materialize, but is substantial.
Welcome to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers Podcast. Each episode will bring you conversations from business leaders and up-and-coming stars in the commercial real estate industry in Canada. Our guests will share their unique career journeys, passions, and advice on what it takes to be successful in this industry. This podcast is brought to you by Highview Partners, connecting people who perform in Canadian real estate.
In this episode, I will be connecting you with Jeff Ranson. With a focus on market transformation in the building industry, Jeff has worked for a number of leading organizations over the last 15 years, including the Canada Green Building Council, Building Owners and Managers Association of Toronto, and now Northcrest Developments. Jeff has also participated in a number of public advisory roles, including the Waterfront Design Review Panel and the City of Toronto Climate Advisory Group. His career has included intergovernmental work at the national to provincial to municipal level, and more recently on a hyper-local level, leading sustainability and responsible development for one of the largest master plan communities in North America. Today, we'll shine the spotlight on ESG and decarbonization across Canadian real estate and look at the many ways we can create a lasting impact on our industry. So tell me, how delighted are you that we're not video recording this today?
I am immensely delighted, James, on a Friday morning, and I am still very much in the post-COVID flex work. Slightly less than business casual.
The same for me as well. Well, look, Jeff, great to have you here. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's begin by talking about ESG, buzz acronym of Canadian real estate. And it's been given a lot of airtime across the industry in the last few years. And a substantial number of real estate companies are now engaging in the conversation. They're building out their ESG divisions. We've been involved in a surge in hiring across all levels of seniority, both in ESG as well as decarbonization. So it's definitely been very busy times for the Highview team. So my first question to you, should ESG continue to be the buzz, or could it be re-engineered in such a way to be more relevant and impactful?
Good question. I mean, first of all, I will empathize with you guys on the recruiting side because not only is ESG buzzy, it's also still relatively brand new in the grand scheme of things. And so in terms of senior leadership, most of the people I know, my peers and colleagues that I know in the space are really the first people who have ever had this job. So it's still not really something that you can learn. And so finding experienced people coming up through the pipeline is always challenging as we continue to grow this skill set. So it's been really interesting to see how this whole field of this professional class has really just sort of emerged and is defining itself as we go. But I think as you can tell, there is demand, and there's demand in investing in people and senior leadership to drive this. I think that's indicative of where the market is headed, that this is kind of crossed that threshold of going mainstream and sticking. Now, it's still complex and it's still somewhat unequally distributed between different building categories and different markets, but globally speaking, that's the trend. I think it's going to stick around because it's a very useful tool for both the investment community for sort of evaluating real estate portfolios in a global context, and dealing with a lot of pretty complicated emerging regulatory risks and sort of real tangible environmental and social risks that we largely ignored, that maybe I think we're seeing are coming to reality or coming to fruition a little bit sooner. So it's still going to be here. Certainly there's room for improvement and innovation. I think one of the biggest things is making sure that you're not spending all of your time on the measurement side of ESG, that you're actually taking action. And, there has been a lot of discussion about, broadly speaking, about is ESG really good for the bottom line? And I think that was sort of thrown out there in the early days, that if you do this, it's It's good for the environment, it's good for people, it's also good for business. I think that's sort of true. Certainly in an up market when everything's booming, it's a great differentiator. It's a great way to separate yourself from the pack. In a tighter market where people are looking at budget cuts, it can be viewed as a cost center. There's always going to be some debate about the value, and I think the value comes down to, are you really being impactful?
Hmm.
And focusing on that, streamlining the process to make it as efficient to do all of the administrative stuff that's required, driving action, and also internalizing ESG so it's not sort of a layer you're putting over everything, but everybody's more and more familiar with it as part of their regular business practices and operations. It's not as much of an additional expense, let's say.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that there is demand. It is a useful tool. ESG is important. It's a complex matter, and we need to continue moving towards strategic action and moving away from just ticking the checklists. And as you mentioned, streamlining processes is going to be key to innovation. I myself, I've attended a number of panel discussions in the last year, and decarbonizing portfolios and achieving those net zero targets were hot topics of conversation. Can you talk about the importance of carbon planning and net zero, Jeff, and how do we go about moving the needle in the right direction?
Carbon is probably the biggest issue that we're looking at, and I mean, really, I think it's critically important. If you sort of follow climate science, and not just throw years out like 2030, 2040, 2050, but I think that there's largely consensus that our time for sort of dithering about this is past, and that we really need some immediate action. And so, for real estate portfolios, buildings last a long time, so the things that you're owning, buying, operating, developing today, these are assets that are very much going to be part of the low carbon economy that's coming, that needs to come very quickly. And so we need to get out ahead of this because the economics of decarbonizing a building are really about understanding your capital plans, understanding what do you need to do and when do you need to do it most cost effectively. I think that's it's really important, and most of the big firms get it. They're being also pushed, even if they're reluctant, they're now getting pushed by their investors who are really looking at decarbonizing their investment portfolios. They're getting from tenants who are looking to decarbonize their business operations, and they're getting it from regulators. We started in the city of Toronto, where I'm located. We have a zero carbon by 2040 goal. 2040 is not very far away. If you've got a building and you're operating with mechanical equipment with a 25-year life expectancy. Anything you put in your building as of today is going to be there in 2040. So, that's really the big issue. So we got to start thinking about it. That's the first thing, and we really need to scale up. And that's kind of, it's been a really exciting couple of years because we've seen in our markets in Toronto and Vancouver, real building projects actually doing significant work on, hitting zero carbon targets that I don't think people really thought was feasible for mainstream commercial properties 10 years ago. It's happened. Things are moving very quickly, but we have a lot of buildings to decarbonize and to get engaged in the conversation of decarbonization.
Yeah, it is moving quickly, and there's pressure coming from all angles. Carbon, it's a big issue. It's critically important, and I agree with you. We need immediate action. You raised some really good points there, so thank you for that. Now, some might say that companies could fall or have fallen into the trap of carbon tunnel vision. What would you say? Would you say that's the case?
I think so. I think, and largely, I think it's been used as a metric that is universal, and so that's part of the reason. Again, I think there's a lot of other performance expectations you can put on a property. There's a lot of other impacts, but there's nothing that sort of has the universal nature of carbon. Doesn't really matter where you are in the world. People are talking about carbon. So it's not even as geographically specific. The planet doesn't really care where the carbon comes from. So you've got to think about it. So I think it's having that sort of common language that's made it, front and center in most people's thoughts. And it's sort of that critical existential threat. I said there's other things that you can certainly do and other things we should be thinking about, but it's the existential nature of climate change that has people really thinking about this at this scale. There's lots of other things that we could focus on. I certainly think materiality and waste is a big issue, and you hear about, plastic pollution and what's being done around that, and construction uses a lot of materials, real estate generates a lot of waste, and we got to think a little bit about that, but still relatively a small environmental footprint compared to the collective carbon footprint of real estate. And then, locally, social impacts, things like affordability, well-being, those are really, really important. They just tend to be a little bit more localized. The needs are more specific to the community you're in. So you're not going to see as many sort of large scale conversations about those issues the way you are with carbon.
Yeah, you mentioned there that there are many other expectations and impacts beyond climate change, obviously climate change being the big conversation. So what are some of the other important items beyond carbon plans and net zero commitments that we should be addressing within the industry?
On the real estate side, carbon's a big thing. Getting your carbon plans in order is huge. Setting targets, a lot of that's fallen on the properties themselves. So I'd say as an industry, one of the interesting things that I've been thinking a little bit about is to support scale. There's only so much you can do at the building level. There becomes a little bit of diminishing returns in terms of those investments in energy efficiency and decarbonization. And we really have seen, I think, the commercial real estate industry moving faster than some other parts of our ecosystem. And so the utilities is a really key part of that. We're seeing a lot of buildings move towards electrification as an example to decarbonize, but we really, really need a low carbon electricity grid in order for that to be an effective solution. And that hasn't necessarily been moving in the right direction as quickly as we want it to, or with the sort of level of certainty that if I'm a building owner and I've got to make a choice on what kind of heating system I'm putting in, that I can count that the grid is going to be clean enough for me to hit my really aggressive carbon targets using grid electricity without having to buy additional green energy credits or offsets.
Mm-hmm.
So utility innovation would be huge. Getting that certainty would save collectively a huge amount of money and effort. I would argue probably it's more effective to spend our money at the utility level. It's a much bigger spend, but if you add up every building having their deep retrofit every single property they own, that's significant. Some of the other things I think in Canada, in particular North America broadly, the biggest challenge we have are kind of our poorest performance in the real estate space is actually more about land use planning and placemaking. We're still very car oriented. Where we put our buildings often will have a bigger carbon impact than what those buildings look like moving forward. That's not something that the real estate community has necessarily thought all that much about. We still see a lot of push towards convenient locations to highway access. That's not particularly great from an environmental perspective. It's not very good from a community perspective as well, or from a quality of life perspective. And then even when we're starting to locate in cities, really making sure that developments are enhancing the community and making a better place to live and to work and attracting people is going to be really important to getting those people back to work, improving the whole economic vitality of the cities where we're locating our businesses in. And so we really need to be additive. Not just sort of picking a neighborhood that has good amenities and building nearby in proximity to that, but actually enhancing that community in that neighborhood. So I'd love to see a lot more, work. And we've seen some recent really exciting projects like the Well that I think are really doing some interesting work around placemaking. And I think we also need to think about, as an industry, looking at policy reforms that make it easier, cheaper, faster to build quality buildings and low carbon buildings. And some of that falls into, things like tax reform, figuring out more effective ways to do development charges, thinking about property tax reform that recognizes buildings that are actually more beneficial to the community, less impactful, lower carbon footprint, and what can we do around that? So the last big thing that we really need to focus on is affordability. That's both residential affordability and dealing with the housing crisis, but also affordability for small businesses in markets, and not just thinking about affordability in terms of rental prices, but total cost of living, and what role can real estate play in making life in general more affordable for everybody.
There is only so much we can do at the building level. And as you've rightly pointed out, there's a lot more we need to look at more broadly speaking, utility innovation, placemaking, policy reforms, and as well as real estate affordability. So you've highlighted some really good points there. Taking those points forward, how do we approach these matters in the right way, Jeff?
I think, with some of these big issues, I think you're right. You can only tackle so much, and I think the inclination for pretty much anybody, you tackle the problem that's immediately right in front of you. And the fragmented nature of the real estate industry, I think sometimes makes it hard for us to collectively organize around things that I think are really valuable to us. And there are associations that I think are really important to bringing the community together and organizing around those collective values and pushing for policy change. I think that's really important. I think things like affordability need to be handled in partnership with government, with the community, and the real estate community actively involved in dialogue. And I also think we need to be really clear about what our objectives are, making sure that we are measuring the important things that deliver those outcomes, and then really looking hard at policies and processes and business operations to make sure that they're aligned with those things. There's a lot of times where we say we want to accomplish something, but the systems that we've got in place really aren't supportive or indicative of those things that we really value. So we do have to look at that alignment.
Yeah, it is fragmented and it does make it quite challenging. But as you pointed out, setting clear objectives, having that collective voice and flexibility in the policy programming and business operations could certainly make a difference. Now, let's talk about making our buildings more resilient. What does that mean inside of ESG and how do we go about it?
So the resilience side, I think, generally speaking, is looking at the risk profile of real estate. And I think maybe after this summer in Toronto with wildfire smoke is so bad that you couldn't go outside, maybe it's a little bit more top of mind. And obviously in other parts of the country that have had much more direct exposure to things like wildfires, we're very aware of this. And I think it is really a material financial risk for real estate to understand the physical risks associated with their geography, whether it's sea level rise, extreme weather, or wildfire. And I think we're starting to develop a little bit more sort of robust understanding of what those physical risks are. And then obviously building strategies around the resilience. Now that means, physical hardening of the assets to make sure that they are, they can withstand real physical risks, having good policies in place and planning for if something does happen, how do you address it in the short term in that crisis mode, but how you get back up to full operating capacity as quickly as possible with this, as little disruption as possible. The most challenging part of this is sort of what I would classify as a systemic risk management, which is, you've got a building, it's also part of a city or it's part of a province that has its own systems and networks in place. If the bigger system goes down, what do you do and how do you mitigate against that? If transportation networks go out, if energy networks go out, what can you do and how do you build in resilience against those broader impacts that aren't just at the property level? A little bit trickier. Some of it means maybe internalizing some functions or backup functions, but also thinking about, more operationally, how do you support community resilience more broadly? How do you support, whether it's government or community groups who are going to be responding to events so that, you've got a full suite of tools at your disposal.
Mm-hmm. When you talked about the bigger systems going down, the first thing that came to mind was the Rogers crash of was that 2022?
Yeah, it's having redundant telecommunication systems. If that stuff's go down, or if transportation networks are compromised, what do you do? Can you help your tenants switch to remote work? Maybe not as much of an issue now, but even extreme weather events, can you offer cooling centers in certain places? There's a lot of interesting innovations that are being done within real estate to help the broader community withstand these sort of events and minimize community level disruption.
Indeed. Now let's talk about financial implications of ESG. Is it safe to say you can make money doing good?
Yeah, I think generally, I think so. Again, everything's nuanced in the ESG space. I think that ESG, you are investing in impacts that may not directly be financial impacts. In some cases, energy savings is going to save you money, but a lot more times you're improving an experience or you're delivering some other tangible impact that you've got to indirectly tie back to financial values. So I think that those investments, the first key here is, are you getting better at doing those? Are the costs coming down through experience and through scale and through normalization of those practices? And I think a lot of that's happened. The cost of doing some of these things has come down to the point where it's, cost neutral. It's just typical cost of doing business. Then the inverse of that is, are we doing a better job of communicating the value or capturing the value from these things? And sometimes there's some sophistication to that, but I think that's, really good firms are finding ways to drive real financial value from ESG. The bigger question is sort of this abstract notion of risk avoidance. And I think you have to have that eye to risk. Sometimes we're doing stuff that we hopefully will never need. But if a climate event does happen or something more serious at a macro, scale, a global crisis happens that we can contribute to avoiding, that has a significant risk mitigation impact that's a little bit harder to capture and materialize, but is substantial. And there's going to continue to be debate around that. But as I say, the nuance is that it's not true for all markets. Some markets have a much harder business case based on the way that those specific markets are structured. A lot of sustainability or ESG benefits lean towards or are more supportive of real estate companies that have long-term skin in the game. They benefit from those upfront investments because they can capture the value over time. They realize the risk reduction over time. Harder for short-term markets. And then, in other cases, the ESG impacts that you're delivering are really public benefits, more so than they are specific building benefits. And that can be really problematic if it's something that you're doing strictly on a voluntary basis that your competition doesn't necessarily have to deal with. And so if in those cases, we would love to see more policy alignment, at a governmental level, pushing for at least sort of universal responsibility, or in the case of real public benefits, the solutions coming as public solutions, not necessarily voluntary private solutions. So, yeah, those are things that can be a drag on businesses who are doing stuff way above and beyond, sort of minimum industry requirements.
Well, it's great to hear, in your opinion, that we're getting the cost down through experience and scalability. Flipping the question away from the financial implications into how we invest, do you feel we are investing in ESG in the right way at this time?
I mean, I think there's a lot of different approaches that people are taking to in the investment side, and there's still a lot of experimentation going on and people trying to figure that out. And I think that's okay. And maybe it's good. I think ESG, or the impacts we're trying to have, it's a complicated problem. So it's probably worth trying many different approaches. The challenge with wicked problems, I think, is often that as humans, we sort of look for magic bullet solutions, that there's going to be something we figure out, one size fit all, it works. It makes everything really easy. And I think it's a little bit naive. I think we're going to have to approach this in a bunch of different ways, and to meet the variety of needs from the different ownership structures of companies, the different markets that we play in, the different risk profiles and returns. So I think that we're not going to find one simple way to do it. And I won't say there's sort of a right way or a wrong way to do it. So where we've been successful is in the market leadership and sort of bigger, successful companies who are building pretty sophisticated tools, who have the expertise and the resources to invest in this. And particularly when we talk about investing, and so let's talk like financing, where these long-term investments in things that generate long-term benefits, environmental impacts over time, with big upfront capital expenses, are really good or translate really well to patient capital, things like pension funds or large investment companies that are interested in long-term stable returns and lower risk. They also tend to take really big bites. They like to, eat in big chunks. So that works well in some parts of the market. Broadly speaking, we're having trouble in investing in ESG at the lower end of the market, smaller properties outside of major centers, geographically distributed. We haven't really figured out how to do that effectively. It's harder to capture those long-term benefits. It's harder to attract capital in those markets. We don't necessarily have the right tools. So I do think we still need a lot of innovation to sort of take investment in ESG down market, to show the value, to create the right kind of tools and programs that aren't too administratively heavy, both for the investors who are trying to evaluate, should I put my money into this? Small little projects take a lot of time to evaluate. We need ways to scale up that analytical process, and then for these smaller places, just finding investors who have product that's accessible to them and with the expertise and resources they have available is going to be a challenge we need to deal with.
Yeah, there's definitely many different approaches. And as you said, there's no right or wrong, there's no universal code. It really needs companies to just look at what's going to work for them best in terms of an investment strategy going forward.
Are you ready to find the best next hire to join your real estate business? Highview is committed to finding the best talent to fit your hiring needs. Our teams specialize in recruiting across strategic, operational, and corporate roles at all levels, from coordinators, analysts, and operators to managers, directors, and vice presidents. We have been developing our real estate network for over 30 years, and we actively scout and track emerging talent entering the industry. Our knowledge and experience allow us to engage passive candidates in a highly impactful way, making sure that you are hearing from only the best. To find out more, contact us today or visit us at highviewpartners.ca.
Taking the conversation away from the industry, Jeff, and now moving it towards your career path. I understand the primary focus of your career over the last 15 years has been this idea of driving market transformation through innovation and sustainability. How did this become your focus?
Yeah, no, I'm not an engineer or environmental scientist. So I've never been one to sort of focus on the technical solutions to these problems or on things like climate change. My background is originally from business school and later on did a master's in design focused on sort of strategic systems change. But my interest in the built environment and in sustainability goes back a very long time. And when I was really interested in getting into this space and having an impact in a meaningful way, not being a sort of technical expert, I recognized pretty quickly that even though we have technical solutions, there are smart people who can figure out how to do this stuff, we aren't doing it at scale. We're either too slow to roll stuff out, or we're not really capturing all the market. And the question was always like, well, why not? And I think that when you look at these problems, it's because it's a complex systems change problem, and these sort of wicked problems cross disciplines. And so to get groups working together to see that change does not happen on its own, and it really needs people and thinking that integrate ideas that find alignment across these silos. And that's kind of the role that I've taken on over the years, working with different nonprofits associations, but really just focus on, like, you need to have leadership driving change. You need to have people organizing conversations to get people on the same page, to show that there's alignment, there's collective movement, that there's interest in these things. And so I think that's always been the piece that's interested me, is how all these pieces fit together so that we can actually scale up and achieve the things that we think are technically possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly need leadership to drive change. And as you mentioned, there's many moving pieces. Talking about moving pieces and some of the projects that you've been directly involved with, which ones stand out from the pack in terms of accelerating policy and programmatic thinking?
This isn't sort of one program, but a sort of suite of programs. The idea in real estate of benchmarking, and in particular sort of energy, water, and greenhouse gas benchmarking. I've been involved in many of these sort of iterations of benchmarking across the country, from Ontario's EWRB regulation, helping to inform that, to BOMA Toronto's Race to Reduce program, consulted with different municipalities on benchmarking programs. And we've seen a lot of this. And again, this is a project that started off with a really sort of simple proposition that can't manage what you don't measure. The first challenge is getting everybody in the real estate community just capturing data and reporting it so that they can learn important things about how their buildings run and operate. And that could be by comparing it to your peers in a really transparent way when you previously never had access to your peers' performance data, or it could be just comparing your building to your own portfolio or comparing your building to itself over time. But just normalizing that practice of benchmarking has led to a whole suite of more operationally focused improvements that people can make. And that's sort of been the good side, in that we've seen that, just the act of benchmarking over time drives to significant improvements in performance. The bad side, and I'll sort of talk about this, when things sort of fail to roll out effectively because they don't have all the pieces together. We've had voluntary benchmarking that's been pretty effective, but it still hasn't captured the whole market. And so we see certain regions, certain property types that aren't participating, and it creates a bit of a polarized marketplace. So it can be viewed as unfair because you've got some who are doing this extra work to report their energy data and others who don't. You could also look at the inverse, where those buildings that aren't reporting are actually falling behind, and you're ending up with a two-tiered market where you've got high performance real estate in some places and lower performance real estate in others, and that becomes, economically even a negative overall. That these assets, particularly maybe smaller portfolios in rural areas or smaller towns, aren't as good. They're not as valuable. They're losing value in the marketplace. And that's largely because I think we haven't done a good job with the public side of things about rolling these programs out in effective ways and providing the resources for these other groups to participate in this program collectively. It hasn't had that universal appeal. It hasn't had the level of awareness, the level of understanding about what the real value is driving forward. So, so it's had some great wins. It has tons of potential, and I think is critically important for underpinning a lot of the future ambitions of the real estate sector. You can't really run decarbonization programs if you don't have benchmarking as a sort of standard baseline you can measure against. We still haven't got it to the point where it's quick and easy to do and universal and everybody understands what it is, and that with all this great data, we're using it for all the potentially beneficial uses that we could have, both for tenants being more aware of what's happening, the public, regulators, and everybody. So, just examples of sort of really complex pieces with lots of moving parts and lots of stakeholders, and how important it is that everybody gets on the same page and works together.
Well, congratulations on the benchmarking programs where you've had impact. And as you pointed out, there's just still so much more to be done in terms of raising awareness and generating value out there in the market. If we were to look at transformation, Jeff, in terms of where we were in the market back in 2008 when you joined the industry versus where we are today, what would you say have been some of the big wins for the industry as a whole?
2007, 2008 was an interesting time. I mean, I think that's when green started to go mainstream, when things like LEED really took off, and there were some early, I'd say early big wins, even just around the idea of being public around your environmental performance, and things like certification was really important. And those also unlocked some really big successes around things like even simple things like the mainstreaming of green cleaning practices and low VOC paints. And a lot of that was codified in those early rating systems. And those are pretty standard and ubiquitous now. And then more recently, I think there's been a lot of progress on energy management, things like continuous improvement year over year, and making that a regular business practice, not sort of a one time, do an audit, do a retrofit, but really managing buildings and improving continuously over time. So we've seen tremendous progress in those areas. And then more recently, the transition to greenhouse gas emissions and really understanding those operational emissions and targeting those. And as I mentioned earlier, a few real projects, big commercial, privately funded projects hitting zero operational carbon was relatively unheard of in 2008. So those have been, huge strides. Some other big areas of progress, which I think are still emerging issues we haven't really figured out. Embodied carbon is buzzing right now, maybe more so on the construction side, but we are really thinking about that in terms of the renovation space and everything around all of the carbon emissions that are produced when we're building a building and the materials that we bring into buildings. And that's taking off, and the literacy around that is growing in leaps and bounds, and now starting to manifest in regulation. Smart buildings and the digital transformation, the integration of AI and these kind of systems, those are also really starting to become really exciting areas. So this was definitely future tech when I started, very much off the radar, and now being rolled out in really interesting ways.
Exciting times with many of the strides that we're making out there in the industry. So knowing what we know about the wins and the losses over the past 3 decades, as companies now look ahead towards 2030 goals and beyond, what do you think should be front of mind as they begin to navigate the framework for achieving their targets?
Probably a few things. Some of the lessons learned, I think, uh, especially when we're looking at sort of these transformative changes or with a long-term horizon, like a 2040 or 2050 target to decarbonization, it's really important to have clarity of vision, to be really clear on what it is that you're trying to do and what the end point is, and figuring out what the best way to get to that end point is, instead of sort of maybe the old way of thinking about it, which is where am I today, and what can I realistically do over the next 2 or 3 years. That doesn't necessarily get you where you want to go. So having that clarity of vision, having a target, is really important. One of the big challenges, and I would say that is that the landscape around us is still in flux. The policy environment could change depending on who's in government at different levels. A lot of the regulatory stuff, and I mentioned some of the utility progress that we were hoping on, isn't quite firmed up to the point where you can count on it. So you do have to be very aware that those things are fickle and they can change rapidly, and you can't necessarily rely on them entirely to reach that vision. You've got to be aware of them and nimble and flexible. But saying, I'm going to wait until a greenhouse gas target is absolutely codified and certain may be too late for when it's economically achievable to address the emissions in your buildings. So be aware of those fickle items, and then also think about the big external risks that imposes. The risk if policy changes more rapidly than you anticipate, or if the market shifts and the investment community shifts. Managing risk is going to be a really key point and a real challenge.
Yeah, you raised some really good points there in terms of identifying and clarifying your vision, assessing risk, and also the landscape, which is forever changing. Given the work that you did at BOMA Toronto, you had the opportunity to collaborate with numerous property management firms, as well as the Canada Green Building Council, CGBC. What are the characteristics of the better companies or best companies in the market when it comes to ESG?
Yeah, I think that one of the pleasures of working for associations for so many years is you get that exposure to all sorts of different companies, and are often celebrating the success of companies who are doing really innovative things in the marketplace and taking those leadership positions, and have driven a lot of this change that we now sort of take for granted. And so, a lot of that, I always say that you need a champion, you need leadership. This is change management. It's doing things in a different way. If you don't have the people and the resources to enable that change in really constructive ways, things tend to move a little bit slowly. And it's certainly very helpful to have that at the very top of the company. And you see some of the companies out there now who have very senior level commitment to this. Things can move really, really quickly. But I've also seen a lot of companies who have really, where individuals have led from the bottom and really started to push and transform and help companies navigate this stuff. But that's critically important. Certainly the companies who have invested the resources into this in terms of personnel and expertise have had a lot of success, which isn't always easy. But also that you're not in it alone, that there's a lot of aligned organizations and services that are available, whether it's through the utilities, the different utility incentive programs, and companies that have gotten very good at reaching out to those entities for help and support and using the programs that are available. Oftentimes it's municipalities, sometimes it's local environmental organizations, community groups who mobilize change. Lots of groups are out there looking to help and support people. So that willingness to partner and collaborate on change, I think, has been really important. And then the last thing I think has been enabled greatly by setting corporate-wide performance targets, where ESG isn't just sort of a single report that lives on its own. It's something you're measured in your evaluation of employees and your financial analysis. You really need to integrate these ESG goals into your core business function areas and make it part of the way you operate as a business for it to be effective. I don't think if ESG is just always a layer that you're putting on top outside of your core business, it's always going to be undervalued and a bit of a drag on the business.
Well, Jeff, thanks for walking and talking us through your perspectives around ESG and carbon more broadly speaking, and then taking us through your career. In this final part of the pod, it's an opportunity to leave our listeners with some advice on how they can make a lasting impact. So let's start with real estate companies, first of all. So for companies who are new to the ESG space, or perhaps have a ESG strategy, but they're feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of work that is required. Where should they begin, or where should they start to look at resetting the clock?
For sure. I said earlier, there's no real magic bullet, but I'll maybe pick on three things that I think are pretty good places to start if you don't know where to begin. The first one is just benchmarking properties. Pick some impact areas that you really want to address that you think are really important to your company, whether it's carbon or energy, utility stuff, or whether it's social metrics that you really want to measure, and just start getting data. Figure out what you can learn about your properties. That's always going to be a big starting point to really inform any future analysis that you do. The second thing, and this isn't always the case, but I recommend people chase early wins. Sometimes there's a tendency to look at where's the biggest problem that I can solve. What's the worst performing building I have, where there's the biggest opportunity for improvement. But oftentimes, it's a really hard project, and I've learned from a few of my colleagues who have had some really big wins that sometimes, especially when you've got to get buy-in at high levels, pick some early wins just to show it's possible, get people on board and understanding what it is you're talking about without trying to tackle the absolute biggest problem you've got can be really important to getting that momentum and support. So don't make your life harder on you than it needs to be at the get-go. And then I always say partner with the right people. If you're new to this, there is a lot of expertise out there. There are some great consulting firms. So dig around, talk to your colleagues, find out who people are really happy with and have been doing really good work, because there's a ton of good ideas. And the cost of all this stuff, it's not just technical proficiency, but the proficiency in integrating this thinking into different business models and into your regular business operations is really important. It can be a really painful process with the wrong partners and the wrong team, or it can be a really enlightening process. So do your due diligence, find the right people, be picky, but put together a good team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great advice there for real estate companies, whether you're seasoned or whether you're new to the table. Now, for those who are near the sunset of their career, wanting to leave their legacy and a lasting impression, can you make some suggestions as to what they should take on and what would be most impactful for the next generation of real estate leaders?
Amazing things about ESG and the rise of ESG is it provides this really unique opportunity to create a legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of senior leadership, this is still a really new area, and they might be really trying to understand the impact that they can have. And so, firstly, I think if you're part of the older generation who was doing something one way for 20 or 30 years, this is not to criticize what you did or what you were trying to do, but it's also very important to recognize that life is a lot different for younger people. The things that they're worried about, the values they have, the issues around things like affordability. I mean, the culture has changed quite a bit. So I think the first thing is, spend some time talking to your young team members, or even younger people who might not be working with you, to really understand what life's about for them, and how their job and how this business impacts them in their daily lives. I think grounding in that, is going to be really important to understand what it is that you are in fact leaving behind, and it's going to be a really big shift, and things are going to continue to change radically. And I guess one of the biggest risks is trying to cling on to this world that's very familiar to us. May seem like we're doing a real service to people and protecting the way things have always been, but in reality, there's some stuff I think that a lot of young people feel needs to change. And so I think it behooves you to really understand what that looks like and be a part of that change, and pass the next generation off the things that they want, not the things that sort of nostalgia tells you, would be valued by that group. So that would be my first starting point.
Yeah, some very valid points there, not just holding on to the past, but really looking at the next generation and understanding the way that they think and they operate and what is really going to work well for them moving forward. So great advice for the sunsetters and looking at those that are more towards the sunrise of their career. And this brings us to our last question. So before we wrap up, I just want to say a big thank you for joining us on the People Who Perform podcast. It's been, great to get your wisdom and your perspective and from your experience in the industry. And that brings us to the last question of the day, which is for the leaders of tomorrow. What food for thought would you give to our future leaders in the ESG space?
always one of my favorite things to discuss, and I think one of my favorite things about the position I've had is a chance to talk to lots of young people who kind of want to figure out how to get into this space. They want to have an impact in their work. They want their work to align with their values, and they don't really know where to start or what, and usually the question is phrased in some context of like, what's the most important thing to do? Because they see these big problems and they see them as being, critical to solve, but super complicated and really hard to get oriented around. My answer is maybe two parts. The first is you have to understand that none of us are big enough to solve this problem on our own, right? So there's not like if you find the perfect task, the perfect project, you have all the skills and you apply yourself to that one thing, the whole market isn't going to change. Not even if you're Elon Musk, you can't change these systems, at that level. And so, there will be things that have bigger impacts and lesser impacts, but it's a massively complicated system that needs change every node in the network, let's say. So within something like the building environment, we need regulatory change, we need technical change, we need to change consumer attitudes, we need to innovate in the utility space. We need innovation in financial markets. These are all things that we need to have, and none of them will drive that change independently. But if we don't have change in all of those areas, it will stop the market transformation from happening. So when you think of it that way, the response is really, it's all pretty important to do as long as it's all aligned and moving in the same direction. We need people working on all of it. So if you're looking for the most important thing to do, I usually say, what's your aptitude and where's your passion? Where within this massively complex thing are you going to be able to wake up every day and pour your energy into it, be excited about tackling this piece of it and knowing it's having a contribution to this much bigger thing that we're all trying to work on. And I mean, that's it. If you can do that every day and you're having an impact, I'd be hard to say there's anything more important you should be doing.
Thank you for listening to People Who Perform, the Real Estate Careers podcast brought to you by Highview Partners, a talent search and recruitment firm focused exclusively on Canadian real estate. If your real estate team is looking to find the best next hire, or if you're ready to make the best next move in your career, then reach out to Highview Partners today. Follow us on LinkedIn and visit us at highviewpartners.ca.